Imagine the United States collapses tomorrow. Writing is lost. Cities are abandoned. For 400 years, nothing's recorded. Then, centuries later, someone pieces together a poem passed mouth to mouth for generations that mentions the White House, the Super Bowl, and nuclear submarines. Some details are eerily accurate, others are wildly wrong. The poem claims Americans ride nuclear submarines to the grocery store, separating what's real from what's garbled. Nearly impossible. That is the problem scholars face with Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey describe a world of heroes, palaces, and gods, but they aren't straightforward history. They contain elements from multiple centuries. Mycenaean Bronze Age survivals coexist with Dark Age realities. The poems are archaeological sites in text form. Determining what kind of society they depict reshapes our entire understanding of Western civilization's origins. To get there, we need the scholarly debate, the available evidence, and the story of how these poems were made. Scholars have debated for over a century which historical period Homer's poems depict. Their positions form a spectrum. On one end, Barry Strauss argues the poems faithfully reflect the Bronze Age world around 1200 BCE, the era of the Trojan War. Andrews places them among post-Mycenaean colonies around 1100 BCE. Moses Finley, whose position represents the broadest scholarly consensus, argued the poems primarily reflect 10th and 9th century Dark Age society, centuries after the Mycenaean collapse. Ian Morris pushes the date forward to the 8th century, Homer's own probable lifetime. And A.M. Snodgrass questions whether any coherent historical society can be recovered from the poems at all. The consensus clusters around Finley. The poems contain Bronze Age fossils, but the social world they describe belongs to the Dark Ages. Three categories of evidence illuminate the Greek Dark Ages. First, and overwhelmingly most important, Homer's poems. They are the largest body of evidence for this period by far. Nearly everything scholars say about the Dark Ages depends on them. Homer's poems are the lens through which we see this lost world. Second, Greek legends preserved in later literary sources. These aren't rigorous history, but they can preserve kernels of fact. If all records of 18th century America were destroyed, oral tradition would still preserve the revolution, French military assistance, and Washington's command, alongside the cherry tree myths. Legends garble and embellish, but they rarely invent from nothing. The historian's task is careful sifting. Third, archaeology, tangible and objective, but limited. Objects are mute. Dating, function, and significance all require inference and critical caution. The poems weren't written by a single author at a desk. They were oral compositions built across centuries of performance. In the 1920s, the American scholar Milman Parry traveled to Yugoslavia and studied living oral epic bards, men who performed lengthy narrative poems in verse and music without any written text. Each bard told recognizably the same stories, but every performer added, subtracted, and adapted material. No two performances were identical. Parry then turned to Homer and demonstrated through close textual analysis that the Iliad and Odyssey bear the same structural characteristics: formulaic phrases, recurring epithets, modular scenes that could be rearranged at will. The poems are products of oral tradition, not single author composition. The Greek tradition called its epic performers Rhapsodes, literally stitchers of songs. That word captures the process perfectly. Someone in the Mycenaean period first sang of Greeks attacking Troy. Layer after layer accumulated as rhapsodes performed and reperformed across the Dark Ages of the 10th and 9th centuries. Homer himself, probably living around 750 to 700 BCE, was the final great shaper, or the last and greatest stitcher. The result? A layered product, like a geological cross-section, through centuries of Greek civilization, Mycenaean memories embedded in the deepest stratum, Dark Age social realities forming the middle, Homer's own world shaping the surface. For most of the 19th century, the scholarly establishment dismissed Homer's world as pure mythology. Then Heinrich Schliemann, a wealthy German businessman turned amateur archaeologist, set out to prove them wrong. Working with a copy of Homer in one hand and a shovel in the other, or so the legend goes, he excavated Troy, then Mycenae. Both were real places. Homer's palaces bore striking resemblance to actual Mycenaean remains. At Mycenae, gazing at a golden death mask, Schliemann famously declared, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." He was wrong about that identification, but right about the larger claim. Homer's world had a real historical foundation. The most compelling evidence of genuine Mycenaean content appears in Iliad Book 2, the catalogue of ships. The poet enumerates exactly how many warships came from each Greek town, a detailed roll call of the entire expedition against Troy. Every town named has been archaeologically confirmed to have existed in the Mycenaean period. And here is the crucial detail. Some of those towns disappeared after the Mycenaean collapse and were never re-inhabited. The later poets could not have known these names from their own world. The catalogue must preserve genuine Bronze Age information, transmitted mouth to mouth across 4 centuries of darkness. But Homer also gets the Mycenaean world wrong, and these errors are even more historically revealing than the accuracies. Start with burial. Mycenaeans buried their dead in elaborate shaft graves and massive beehive-shaped solos tombs, monuments requiring enormous labor and immense wealth. Homer's Greeks do the opposite, they cremate their dead. Yolande, the entire Iliad concludes with cremation scenes for Patroclus and Hector. The later poets had never witnessed Mycenaean burial rites. They describe what they knew, the practices of their own era. Then chariots. Chariots were central to Bronze Age warfare across the eastern Mediterranean, functioning as mobile platforms that charged infantry formations. Homer's heroes used chariots merely as taxis, riding to the battlefield, dismounting, and fighting on foot. The memory that chariots belonged in warfare survived. The knowledge of how they were deployed was lost. 3 more discrepancies complete the picture. Literacy. The Mycenaeans had Linear B, a syllabic writing system for palace administration, inventories, tax records, military rosters. Homer's world is fundamentally illiterate. In thousands of lines of verse, only one obscure, ambiguous reference to writing exists. Wealth. Mycenaean kings commanded enormous resources. Their beehive tombs required vast organized labor, the work of centralized states. Homer's kings are comparatively poor, personally overseeing their own farms. Queens. Mycenaean queens presumably held positions of royal privilege. Homer's queens are associated with 2 places, the bedroom and the loom. Domestic production, not Bronze Age royalty. These discrepancies aren't random errors. They're windows into the actual world the later poets inhabited. The poems preserve Mycenaean fossils embedded in a Dark Age society. The transition from Mycenaean to post-Mycenaean society is encoded in 2 words of political vocabulary. Wanax, later shortened to Anax, appears in the Linear B tablets as the supreme king, the absolute ruler atop a palace bureaucracy. In Homer, Wanax applies to only one human, Agamemnon, and even he holds the title only because a coalition of independent leaders chose him as generalissimo for a combined expedition. The title is situational and temporary. The second word, basileus, plural basileis. In the Linear B tablets, a basileus was a minor figure, perhaps a village chieftain, but in Homer and all subsequent Greek history, basileus became the standard word for king. There are no more Wanax, only basileis, local chiefs of roughly equal status. This vocabulary shift is a fossil record of political collapse. Supreme Mycenaean-style kingship had vanished from the Greek world. Homer's basileis lived nothing like Mycenaean palace rulers. No bureaucracies, no scribes, no inventories, no administrative apparatus of any kind. Their principal activities reveal everything about their world. First, agriculture, personally supervising farming on their own estates, more plantation owner than pharaoh. Second, herding, maintaining flocks of goats and sheep. Third, and most prestigious, piracy and raiding. Achilles boasts of sacking 24 cities. In the Odyssey, a stranger is asked without insult whether he's a pirate. Piracy was ordinary and honorable. Raiding was not a deviation from civilized life. It was civilized life for a Dark Age chieftain. But when Odysseus is called a merchant among the Phaeacians, he treats it as a grave insult. A basileus might accept pirate, but never merchant. This compass picture, modest chieftains farming, herding, and raiding without literacy or bureaucracy, fits Dark Age Greece perfectly. The crucial distinction: Homer depicts an aristocratic society, not a monarchical one. The fundamental political division runs between nobility and the commoners, not between a single ruler and everyone else. A council, the bull, was limited to the basileia. An assembly gathered men of fighting age, roughly 18 to 20 and older. Women were entirely excluded from both bodies. Men below fighting age were excluded. And any nobleman, not just Agamemnon, could convene a meeting. Power belonged to a class of aristocrats, not to a single ruler. 2 episodes from the poems reveal this system in vivid action. The Iliad opens with plague devastating the Greek camp at Troy. A seer determines that Apollo is angry because Agamemnon seized a priest's daughter as a war prize. Achilles demands Agamemnon return the girl. Agamemnon refuses, then demands Achilles' own prize as compensation. Achilles reaches for his sword, considers killing Agamemnon on the spot, then sheathes it. He publicly denounces the supreme commander and withdraws his entire force from the war. One Basileus openly challenges the generalissimo and violates no rule. Agamemnon is called Basileotatos, most kingly, a superlative, not an absolute title. His authority rests on preeminence among equals, not unchecked power. The second episode shows the other edge of aristocratic power. Agamemnon tests morale by suggesting retreat. Soldiers rush for the ships. Odysseus intervenes, respectfully persuading noblemen to return, but physically striking and berating any commoner who moves. Then, a man named Thersites, described as the ugliest man in the army, stands and denounces the Basileia. He demands the common soldiers abandon the war and sail home. Odysseus strikes him with a scepter. The army cheers. Thersites' offense was not his opinion, it was the act of speaking at all. Only Basileia possessed the right to address the assembly. Rank determined who could speak and who must stay silent. Aristocracy of birth became the default position in all of Greek political thinking. Anyone arguing for a different system argued against the weight of tradition, stretching back to the Dark Ages. This matters enormously. Athenian democracy was radical precisely because it ran against the entire grain of Greek assumptions. Even Plato's Republic envisions ideal government not as monarchy but as rule by a group of the best. Monarchy came to be viewed with deep hostility, fit for barbarians and Persians, not free Greek men. Homer served as the foundational text of Greek culture for the rest of antiquity. Generals quoted him before battle. Philosophers debated his meaning. Parents used his verses to teach children to read. When Athens and Megara disputed control of Salamis, Spartan arbitrators ruled in Athens' favor because the catalogue of ships placed the Salaminian fleet alongside Athens. Now a shift from politics to worldview. Greek polytheism made a claim that appears unique among ancient religions. Humans, the Greeks held, are of the same race as the gods. Homeric heroes are called Dios, godly, and Isosios, equal unto a god. They are not described as God-fearing or God-loving. They are portrayed as nearly divine equals, yet one absolute limit separates them from the immortals. Gods do not die, men do. This single asymmetry, human greatness set against human mortality, generates what scholars call the tragic vision. The Greeks refused to resolve the tension. They insisted on both truths simultaneously. Human beings are magnificent, and the death is real, final, and terrible. The uniqueness of this position becomes clear through contrast. Consider three approaches to the problem of death. First approach, humans are essentially nothing. Dust, clay, insignificant creatures. Death changes nothing. Life was insignificant. Death merely completes the insignificance. Second approach, Christianity offers the clearest example. Personal immortality is promised to the faithful. The soul endures. Death's sting is removed by eternal life. The Greek tragic view refuses both escapes. It insists simultaneously on human greatness, humans are of the same race as the gods, and on the absolute finality and negativity of death. No consolation, no minimizing. The tension is held permanently, unresolved. That refusal to look away is the engine of Greek tragedy. The most devastating illustration appears in the Odyssey. Odysseus descends to Hades, the Greek underworld, and encounters the shade of Achilles, the greatest hero in Greek tradition. Odysseus congratulates him on his honored status among the dead. Achilles replies, "Better to be the lowest serf on earth than a king in Hades." The greatest hero in Greek literature would trade all his posthumous glory for the humblest life among the living. The Greek afterlife was not punishment and not bliss. It was nothingness, darkness, absence, the negation of life. Only extraordinary offenders like Tantalus, forever reaching for water and grapes that recede from his grasp, suffered specific torments. For everyone else, death meant ceasing to exist. The Greeks held a view of ethics sharply different from modern assumptions. They had no concept of natural rights, no idea that individuals possess inherent claims against the community. Living well meant being part of a well-ordered community, ultimately the polis, the city-state that emerged from the Dark Ages. The polis was the arena in which humans could live fully. Outside it, one was either a beast or a god. There was no notion of withdrawing from society to pursue private happiness. The polis was not an obstacle to the good life, it was the precondition. Even the most democratic Athenians placed community obligations above individual desire. The Enlightenment emphasis on individualism leads logically toward hedonism and potentially nihilism. As Nietzsche argued, moral codes become weapons of the weak. A Greek thinker in the 5th century BCE made the identical argument centuries before Nietzsche. Mainstream Greek thought rejected it. Unchecked self-interest was foolish and destructive. All of these threads, aristocratic politics, the tragic vision, the communal ethic, converge in the Greek response to life's fundamental challenge. The Greeks held a strikingly modern belief. No divine force reliably oversees human affairs. Events occur randomly. It is chance, not virtue, that determines the quality of a life. Given mortality, divine indifference, and randomness, the Greeks forged an answer, the heroic ethic. The legend of Achilles' choice embodies it. Before the Trojan War, Achilles received a prophecy. Stay home and his partial divinity, his mother was the goddess Thetis, would grant him a long life in comfortable obscurity. Go to Troy, and he would die young, but his name as the greatest of the Achaeans would endure forever. Achilles chose Troy, chose death, chose glory. The choice proved sound. His name endures thousands of years later. His father's instruction captures the ethic in 3 words, ion aristeioi. Always be the best. Not morally best, the greatest, the strongest, the most admired among peers, Being the best requires others striving alongside you. Without competition, excellence has no measure. The Greek word for this contest, agon. Greek society was an agonal society saturated with competition at every level. Athletics, the Olympic Games, founded in 776 BCE. Philosophy, the dialectical contest of Sophists and Socrates. Politics, the rivalries between city-states that drove innovation. Drama, playwrights competing at festivals for prizes. Even funeral rites included competitive games, chariot races, boxing, wrestling. The agonal drive, the need to prove excellence in open contest with worthy rivals, shaped every dimension of Greek civilization. Pull back to the broadest view. From the collapse of Mycenaean civilization through 4 centuries of darkness, a new world emerged, poorer, more egalitarian, without writing or bureaucracy, but carrying seeds that would transform human history. The aristocratic political default that democracy eventually had to overthrow, the tragic vision of human greatness set against mortal finality, the vision that would produce Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the agonal spirit that would create the Olympic Games, the philosophical dialogues, and the relentless competitive energy that defined Greek culture, all of it a radical alternative to the divine right kingdoms of the Near East and the individualist philosophies of the modern West. And Homer, the stitched-together oral poem that preserved it all, became the permanent foundation of Greek civilization, a text whose authority endured over 1,000 years. The Greek Dark Ages were dark to us. We have almost no written records, no monumental buildings, no kings whose names survive in stone. But the world that emerged from those centuries was anything but dark. It was the crucible in which the most foundational ideas of Western civilization were forged. Ideas about politics, about death, about excellence, and about what it means to live a fully human life. Every civilization built on their legacy, Rome, medieval Christendom, the Renaissance, the modern West, has returned to Homer as a source. We know his world almost entirely because for 400 years, bards kept singing. In those songs, they carried the seeds of a civilization through the dark.